Nature restoration law. Is it really the end for flagship Green Deal policy? The nature restoration law is at the forefront of discussions among national governments in the Council, while the Parliament has seen its fair share of drama. Despite the compromise reached between the Parliament and the national governments in February, which notably diluted the Commission's original proposal, now Member States are opposing the law. Hello and welcome. I am Evi Chiori and this is Today in the EU. To break down what actually is happening with the nature restoration law and why a few member states are now opposing it, we spoke with Donagh Cagney, Euractiv's energy, environment and transport editor. Passing the nature restoration law was indeed a huge challenge and it sparked a full-on battle in Parliament last year. Can you give us some context about how we got here?
In February of this year, the Parliament voted on a compromise agreement with national governments. And even though that compromise was seriously watered down compared to the Commission's original proposal, the Conservative European People's Party decided to reject it. This was quite shocking, given that the nature restoration law was one of the flagship policies of European President Ursula von der Leyen, herself a European People's Party politician.
Last June, Manfred Weber answered to the criticism his party EPP was receiving regarding the nature restoration law.
Saying in the Envy Committee that EPP should come back to the rule of law principle, and that's why I support the piece of legislation on the table, that is crossing red lines. Because if my party, and nearly half of the members in the Envy Committee are of the opinion that this piece of legislation is a bad piece of legislation, you cannot blame them that they are not respecting rule of law. That goes too far.
The law just about managed to survive the Parliament's vote, thanks to some Conservative and Liberal rebel MEPs voting for the law. But in truth, the Parliament had been struggling with this file for quite some time.
Very decisive because we will see whether Manfred Weber's strategy of a destructive line, of trying to end laws, of trying to block laws, is going to win, or the constructive line of the four constructive groups that are coordinating together so that we can win a majority tomorrow.
Mentioned Terry Reinke, currently the Greens lead candidate for the parliamentary elections, focusing on the challenges of getting the text approved at the plenary session last year.
When the proposal was first submitted to the Parliament, the Agriculture and Fisheries Committee called for the proposal to be rejected completely. And the Environment Committee, who's the lead committee in Parliament on this file, was split right down the middle. Now the file is with national governments in the Council, and as we're seeing, they're facing very similar divisions.
So what does the law actually entail?
The law is intended to protect and restore nature, specifically biodiversity in the EU's territory. There's a lot of different measures in the proposal, but a critical component is the requirement on national governments to restore 20% of Europe's land and sea territory to good condition by 2030 and to restore all ecosystems that need it by 2050.
The clock is ticking for this.
So it covers habitats like forests, grasslands, wetlands, rivers, lakes, coral beds, and there's specific restoration targets for habitats which are classified as being in poor condition. At least 30% of these need to be restored by 2030 to good condition and 90% of these by 2050. The proposal also has a particular focus on some core elements of European biodiversity with specific targets for these. So, for example, grassland butterflies, they're important for pollinating plants. As well as that, things like and the planting of an additional 3 billion trees across the EU. They want 25,000 kilometres of rivers to be free-flowing, so not blocked. Things like they want to see a positive trend in urban green space. So think of trees in city streets and squares. And there's a focus on peatlands as well. So these are areas of wet, acidic soil which are extremely rich in carbon. The text says that Europe must restore at least 30% of drained peatlands by 2030, 50% by 2050, and there are sub-targets there for re-wetting this peatland as well.
And why is this so important?
Nature has, of course, inherent value in and of itself, and it's taken a huge pummeling in Europe for a very, very long time. Now, over 80% of European habitats are in poor shape. And once biodiversity is lost in an area, it can be very challenging to fully get it back. But beyond its inherent value, nature also provides a whole host of different benefits necessary for a comfortable human existence. Things like healthy food, clean air and water, even people's mental health. There's also a very close link between protecting biodiversity and climate action as well. Mm-hmm. And that encompasses both mitigation, so nature is mood changing so that instead of nature emitting carbon, it's instead sucking it out of the atmosphere, but also climate adaptation as well. And nature-based solutions can play a very important role protecting society. Think of flood defences, for example, or trees to cool down cities during heat waves during the summer.
And there have been many talks regarding the need for restoration.
So European ministers held crisis talks on the nature restoration law in Brussels on Monday. And this really was one of the key themes, that the EU can't deliver on our climate goals if we don't deliver on our biodiversity goals as well. And one of the reasons why this law in particular is so important is that while there have been many different reasons why nature is declining, a common element is the encroachment of human activity onto habitats, use of space, essentially. And this is primarily due to activities like agriculture, which takes up 50% of the world's habitable land, and human settlements, towns and cities. Now, there are pre-existing EU rules aimed at helping nature, but they're quite targeted. Things like the Birds Directive, for example.
And the vote that was scheduled for Monday in the Council got postponed. What was that changed?
Yes, in truth, I mean, the nature and biodiversity aspects of the European Commission's Green Deal were probably always a little bit more vulnerable to backlash. It's clear now that business and industry can make money from decarbonisation, electric cars, for example, but this case is harder to make and is less clear with environmental protection measures. Plus the benefits of nature restoration, they're weakly felt by everybody, but the potential costs can be felt strongly by a much smaller cohort of people who are able to motivate and organise opposition.
And you mentioned farmers, and the situation now feels completely different, especially with the protests and the upcoming elections.
So this law was just one element that farmers across Europe have been demonstrating about over the past couple of months, but it's a very symbolic one, and it lent itself to the argument that Europe was prioritising nature over people. Whether that argument is true or not, it certainly is a very potent one. There's also a sense that the Commission's signature Green Deal, which the nature restoration law was a key part, is running out of steam. So the Commission is reaching the end of its mandate. Quite a lot of green legislation has already been passed, and some national leaders, including French President Macron, have called for a pause on new rules and requirements. We've also seen how opposition to nature protection measures can be a powerful tool for political parties at a national level. Mm-hmm. Most notably, the Farmer Citizen Movement, the BBB party, won the popular vote in Netherlands in provincial elections this time last year. And that really made politicians across Europe sit up and take notice.
And you already mentioned that the initial proposal was watered down. How come that even that version, the watered down version, didn't bring the countries to an agreement already?
Yes, it has been watered down quite a bit, and that was certainly the perspective of environmental NGOs, even though they did push for continued support for the law. So while a lot of those headline targets do remain, that language has changed. There are derogations in the text, and instead of results-based targets, for example, we have more efforts-based targets. So member states need to do their best. There's also a new emergency brake on the restoration of agricultural ecosystems, which, as you can guess, is squarely aimed at pleasing partners. There's more flexibility in there to meet the requirements for so-called high diversity landscape features on farms, agricultural ecosystems. So more flexibility in terms of how farmers are obliged to put in place and preserve hedges, tree rows, ditches, ponds, things like that.
But there have been many compromises, right?
So there has been some serious compromises made, and indeed some environmental NGOs talk about the law being hollowed out. Since they initially approved the law, 2 countries have switched from supporters of the law to opponents, the Netherlands and Hungary. It's clear why the Netherlands changed their position. There were national elections late last year. The new parliament became more right of centre with a sizable vote for the populist BBB party. That party subsequently sponsored a motion within the Dutch parliament to oppose the nature restoration law, and that passed. So the current caretaker Dutch government doesn't agree with that change, but they're obliged to respect it.
And you're talking about Hungary, who is once again playing difficult to get. What is it this time?
Honestly, it's not 100% clear why they changed their position. On Monday morning, Alain Moron, the Belgian government representative chairing the meeting of environmental ministers, acknowledged that they really had to better understand Hungary's reasoning. And then in the meeting itself, Hungarian Minister of State for Environmental Affairs, Anika Reis, criticised costs and the subsidiarity principle as Hungary's reasons for opposing the law. She basically was saying that European rules are not needed as member states are free to protect nature as they wish using their own national laws. And she pointed to Hungarian efforts to preserve biodiversity as evidence of that. Possibly with Netherlands changing position, Hungary saw that they were in a position to kill the proposal, which they didn't really like, so they did. Possibly it was to extract concessions on other EU files, but there's been no sign of this so far. And it's an open question whether other member states care enough about the nature restoration law to make concessions to Hungary to pass it.
And do you see the law being approved in the end?
So environmental ministers had an unplanned debate on this point on Monday. Many countries came out in favour of protecting the law. Some came out very strongly. That includes some large member states like France, Germany and Spain. The Belgian presidency of the council says the law is a priority for them and they want to see it successfully passed during their presidency. There's one more meeting of the environment ministers scheduled on the 17th of June. So this could be the last big moment for the current presidency to get the law over the line. It's not the proposal's supporters who will make this happen. One of the opposing or abstaining countries would need to shift their position.
Who else has been setting obstacles to this law?
The Netherlands, Poland, Italy, Sweden, Belgium, Finland and Austria are all against or have abstained on the law, plus, of course, Hungary. And these countries have reasons to oppose the law ranging from domestic political considerations to national interests. So the Belgian presidency will be exploring whether one of these countries or more of these countries could be convinced to change their mind.
Means we're going into a European elections where we say the European system is not working. We do not protect nature. We do not take climate seriously. That would be an absolute shame. And I know there are voices of concern. I read comments, I think, from your own Prime Minister last May when he said maybe in relation to the nature restoration law, perhaps it was time to hit the pause button. He said, let us not lose this momentum by overburdening ourselves with challenges that are not as life-threatening as climate change. The destruction of nature is life-threatening. The destruction of nature is inextricably linked with climate change.
Said Eamon Ryan, Irish Minister for Transport and leader of the Green Party at the EU Environment Council on Monday this week.
The mood amongst the countries who were supporting the law on Monday was defiant, but you couldn't say that it was exactly optimistic.
And what's a key message that we should keep in mind regarding the nature restoration law?
I think that the longer term conclusion is that we really need to make the case for human restoration, to better make the case for nature restoration in human terms. And Spanish Minister for Ecological Transition, Teresa Ribera, touched on this at Monday's morning. As a society, we've made great progress in tackling environmental problems like air pollution, acid rain, the ozone layer, potentially even, hopefully, climate change. And that progress has been possible when society has collectively realised that our fundamental interests are being challenged. We haven't really seen the same dynamic happen in terms of nature protection. Now, to be clear, decision makers always do try and communicate about biodiversity in terms of the benefits for people. And this was the clear line the Commission took from the moment they launched the initiative. But it's very challenging to articulate this vision. Biodiversity is inherently very complex. It's about system effects. And the impacts of biodiversity loss can be very local, very specific to different situations. Humans don't automatically think in these system-based ways. Scientist Ken Thompson made the point that we find it much easier, for example, to care about a panda or a polar bear, but much harder to care about a diverse ecosystem of earthworms and bacteria, even if this is the thing that ultimately allows us to put healthy food on our plates. We've had a similar challenge with climate change, and climate science has learned to communicate much better in terms of clearer graphs, hard targets, clearly described tipping points, for example. For biodiversity, it feels like we're not there yet. Irrespective of whether the nature restoration law passes or fails, we really need to learn to talk better about nature.
Thank you very much, Donagh. I am Evi Chiori, and this was Euractiv's Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. This episode was produced by myself, Miriam Sáenz de Tejada, and Nicoleta Yonta. Thank you for tuning in. We will be back tomorrow. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.